We are very fortunate to have visiting with us today Govind Nair and his wife, Marcella Simon, both active members of the Northern Virginia Ethical Society. Happily, they had a beautiful day and light traffic yesterday to drive all the way up from Fairfax, Virginia, so that Govind could bring us his thoughts on humanism through a globalization lens. Govind's personal and professional interests span all facets of globalization: economic, social, political. Through 20 years at the World Bank, he focused on international development as a researcher, project manager, and finally as lead economist. Since 2010, he has traveled to some 80 countries as a private consultant to governments, businesses, and nonprofits, and as visiting faculty at universities around the world. Govind is currently teaching economics in a master's program at George Washington University. We are very eager to hear his thoughts, and will you help welcome Govind Nair?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very much. It is wonderful to be here. I think it was exactly 1 year ago, yesterday, we were part of a truly global expression of values when we joined 5 million or more people in 500 or more events around the world, and we told ourselves we would be here for the anniversary. Well, we didn't quite join it because we made the journey up yesterday from Fairfax, but we did get echoes of that and more today. We got a first-hand report from some of you who were at dinner yesterday. Wonderful journey, yes, thank you very much, and we've been touched by the warmth of our host, Elaine and Michael, whom I think are here, and Lanny, who then organized this wonderful dinner where we heard from Colleen and Matt about the event that took place in New York yesterday, and met several others of you who are here, Martine, Oliver, Beverly, Errol. So it was wonderful, and I barely spent 24 hours with you. But then I was told that there would be a moment of reckoning, and that I would be up here, and I would have to say something. So my first message is, it's Sunday morning, and I'll do my best, but don't shoot the messenger. Now, globalization is something I've talked about, worked on, and typically I've given a lot of workshops with titles such as Innovation in the Global Economy, Future of Global Labor Markets, and so on. And what I've typically done is lock my victims in a conference room for about 8 hours and subject them to a very severe diet of graphs and data and videos, a lot of talking, and in the true spirit of exchange and free trade, I get a lot back, too. I certainly hope not to subject myself to that, nor you today, because today I truly come in peace. And I come as a fellow humanist who has attempted, over the last several years in particular, to try and distill a set of ideas around how globalization, I think, truly informs what I consider to be our most important humanist moment today. And I think the message for humanists like us does, in a very fundamental sense, come from globalization. And I'm going to develop that idea, but perhaps not in the way that you might expect. Now, for those of you who have a taste for some of the things I usually discuss, we might discuss it over coffee or in the Q&A. But I really would like to engage in this conversation with you as fellow humanists. And I'll be developing 4 themes or 4 priorities which I see as directions which are important for us as humanists. But before I go forward, let me also say that in the spirit of humanism, I'm in a sense dedicating this talk to a very close and dear friend of mine whom I'll be seeing tomorrow, who is battling with cancer and who has spent about 20, 25 years with me going around the world. Somebody from Eastern Europe, very different background than mine, but who has gone to strange places, Mali, Mauritania. We've done some things together which always remind me that there is a part in my soul that attempts to do the best and bring out the best. So how do I start this journey? about humanism and globalization. Well, I think one of the beginnings we can start with is our own beginnings, when we were all Africans, 70,000, maybe 100,000 years ago, very probably in what is today Ethiopia, somewhere in the valleys and mountains in Ethiopia. And if it's not Ethiopia, it may have been South Africa, maybe even somewhere out of Africa, we don't know. The out of Africa hypothesis has a lot of evidence that it did happen in Africa. Regardless, what is important is wherever we came from, we as a species spread around the world. And this was, if you want, the first act of globalization, that as a species, we may have mixed up genetically with some other in the homogeneous Neanderthals in Europe, some others in Central Asia, but we eventually occupied or otherwise harnessed every corner of the globe. And there are several things that are remarkable about that, because it's not simply occupation as a species. While we did that, we continued to exchange ideas, information, practices, animal husbandry. We transported animals, we transported crops across different regions of the world. And in a way, we're doing that same thing that we did when those first drawings appeared on the caves, where we took abstract and symbolic thought, and today we're sending them by moving electrons or moving light across glass or sending out radio waves. We're doing the same thing. But there are other things that are also very significant about what has happened. First is the speed at which it has happened. Because if we scale, as you know, the 4.5 billion years or so that we estimate of the Earth's existence into 1 year, then our discovery of fire occurs 1 second before midnight on December the 31st. And everything that has happened since then, you know, ancient civilizations, the pyramids, ancient Rome, you know, the Enlightenment, all the dynasties of China, all of that occurred in those nanoseconds after that second before December the 31st. And the other thing I think that is quite remarkable about this is we now merit our own geological epoch, the Anthropocene. We have entered the age of the Anthropocene. This is not just some literary metaphor anymore. There are committees of scientists who've decided that because, as a species, we directly or indirectly control 60% or more of the world's water, we affect the atmosphere. We know we do that. We know we can see the greenhouse gas emissions. We can correlate that with average temperature rises at sea and land, and with our own activities. We know this. We know we are affecting species, extinction rates, and so on. So, in a sense, in the short time that we've been here, we merit the same status as an epoch as the millions of years which it took to build chalk bed sediments and limestone caves, you know, in the all the other eras, the Cenozoic era, the Paleozoic era, and so on. So there is simultaneously something almost noble and heroic about the human experience, how much we have achieved, how far we have come, how we have lifted ourselves from a previously brutish and pestilent existence to where we are today. But there's also something terribly troubling about that. Something, if you want, almost deeply threatening in an existential way. And before I proceed, I just want to sort of put up two images, which are very helpful for me when I think about this almost dualistic or contradictory position that we're in. And the first is the image of the Earth itself. If we think about the highest point of the Earth, Mount Everest, and the deepest point, the Marianas Trench, it's about 7 miles. That's our crust. That's the crust that we live on. And if we could compress the Earth down to the size of a tennis ball, you would not feel the crust. That's how thin the crust is. That's how vital and precious it is, but also how fragile it is. And I analogize that to our own society, how we have evolved culturally, and we have created this veneer that we call civilization, we call culture, into which we have put in norms, we have put in habits, we have put in laws, all of which has helped lift us. And yet we are in a fragile situation too. We only have to look back to the last century to see that never in any previous century have so many people perished in world wars, in terrible episodes, the Gulag, the so-called Great Leap Forward in China, what happened in Cambodia in the 1970s, Bosnia, Rwanda, things that are happening today when 150 people perish every day from opioid overdose. I mean, we can go on. There's a catalog, if you want, of tragedies that are taking place at the same time that we have achieved remarkable triumphs, lifting almost 1 billion people out of poverty in the last 30 years. So I think we have to keep in mind, in a very sober way, this kind of dualistic character of our existence as we explore what I think are 4 important directions for us as humanists. 2 of these directions, I believe, concern how we should think, how we should exercise that faculty characteristic of humans and how we think about it as humanists, which is reason. And I think of reason in the broadest sense. It's our power to observe, our power to measure, our power to model and abstract, our power to make predictions. In the modern world, over the last 5 centuries, we've referred to that as science, but this is something that occurred even before what we call the scientific method. So 2 of the directions that I want to speak to concern how we should think, and the other 2 concern how we should act. It concerns the other pillar of humanism, which is our agency. And that is more than just our ability to act willfully. It also has to do with our compassion, how we feel about things, our ethics. And I believe these 2 things, our reason and our agency, inform each other. And I would ultimately go so far as to say that our reason, or our capacity for reason, will and can give us a pathway to come up with a universal set of ethics that I think is applicable across cultures, is applicable across the global society. Some of you may or may not agree with this. This is something that people like Sam Harris, who you may be familiar with, has developed in a book called The Moral Landscape, but which is something I'm increasingly convinced of as I move in and out of societies and cultures. Okay, the first direction, I think, is a priority. We have to deal with and accept our bounded rationality. Bounded rationality, what do I mean by that? I don't mean by that we should accept limits to our knowledge, because I don't know what the limits to our knowledge are. We have learned remarkable things, and I think over the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to see tremendous advances in our understanding of how this greatest instrument in the world, the human brain, works. We may be able to put together all the 4 major forces of nature into one equation and find that holy grail that physicists have been looking for. And there are many more great adventures ahead of us. So there are many things that we're going to learn. However, we also know that we are all vulnerable and susceptible to myth, to delusion, to cognitive biases. And we have a lot of data on this. We tend to find it hard to believe that the future could look very radically different from the past. We tend to look for data that confirms our biases. We keep repeating the same mistakes again and again as individuals and as organizations, even though we know better. And it doesn't matter what our level of education is. This is something that's almost intrinsic to the way we behave. Scientists do this. They have paradigms which shape how they frame a problem and what data they go to select, what data they select to confirm or disconfirm a hypothesis. So this has been true for a long time, but I believe that it has become much more urgent for us to, number one, become aware that this is something we have to deal with, and to actually deal with it with a new set of 21st century literacy skills, a new set of critical thinking skills. Why is that important? I think 100+ years ago, Mark Twain could not have anticipated the internet or the social media, but he did say something that was very prescient when he said that in the time that it takes a lie to travel halfway across the world, truth is still putting on its shoes. We are seeing this play out in very dramatic ways today. And we have a lot of data where we can actually measure how what we read, what we watch has tremendous biases. We can see clusters of media. Sometimes we call this right-wing media, left-wing media, mainstream media. That's a very famous study. It came out last year, the Columbia School of Journalism, which analyzed 1.5 million items of news around the elections, and they clustered these various news sources, looking at their citation patterns. Which sources did they cite? And you'll see a cluster on the right, continually citing each other, the cluster on the left too. It's not just a problem of the right, though apparently on the right there's a greater tendency to live in a hermetically sealed universe. We need to be aware of this problem, because I think we are in the midst of, or if not in the midst, at least on the cusp of a great epistemic crisis, where we have large swathes of population. This is a problem globally which are struggling to distinguish between delusion, myth, lies, and fact and evidence. This is a problem, I think, quite a serious problem. And it is a problem that is going to become even more insidious as the human mind has now created almost a replica of itself in artificial intelligence. And we know from all the studies going forward that the change is happening at a phenomenal rate, where artificial intelligence is taking over tasks that were previously performed by human labor. And there are lots of studies on 50 US cities, China, and so on, which show that typically that within the next 10 years, 70% or more of all tasks that are currently being performed, can be done through robots and AI. Now, what has this got to do with our thinking? Because I think it's also going to affect how the milieu of ideas in which we live, is going to be more consciously shaped by the use of artificial intelligence. So many of you, like me, are civil libertarians. We find it important to protect our civil liberties, and we get concerned when we think about those databases that the governments control and how much they may know about us, about our past. Well, a more important problem is how much they may know about our future. This is actually a serious problem, because the predictive capabilities now of models in terms of what we will like, where we will be, what we will purchase, has reached a very high level of accuracy that it is now possible to very precisely target messages to an individual level and shape behaviors. We hear of these things when we talk about the Russian intrusion into our elections and how targeted messages were developed. We don't talk about it a lot, but there's quite a bit of evidence this happened, but that's only one episode, and it's actually going to get a lot worse. And we may willfully actually abdicate our choice and say, well, maybe it's better to live in a sensory environment that can best titillate our taste without bothering with the real world. Why not? It makes life a lot easier. I do think there are problems with choice and with the whole idea of democracy if we go in that direction. So I think this idea of our bounded rationality, our susceptibility to these kinds of delusion and myth are so important. Which then gets me to the second point, which is it is very, very important for us to therefore reaffirm and preserve that set of gifts that we have to observe, to measure, to theorize, to predict, to validate, which today in a shorthand we call science. I think it's very, very important to do that. And by that I don't mean that we should all be scientists. That is not possible. But we should all acknowledge that we are acting as scientists every day. We are all conducting scientific experiments every day which validate aerodynamics, validate quantum physics, and so on. This is why we know that we step on the plane, it's going to fly, it's going to get us somewhere. This is why we know when we speak to this piece of plastic and glass, it's going to give us information. That information is going to go somewhere. We are testing this. Nomads I worked with in the Sahara who now using mobile telephones, they are conducting scientific experiments every day. And they anticipate, as we do, that there's a very, very high probability that those planes will get us somewhere. There's a very, very high probability that the drugs that we use, will have an impact in terms of infection. This method or this gift that we have today is under serious challenge. What we have to look at is the composition of the scientific committees on science and technology in the House, in our Congress, the leadership we have in various agencies, including the EPA, proposals to cut funding to Earth observation satellites, but allow funding for deep space satellites, take away data that used to be previously available. This is a problem which I think is very endemic to the United States right now, but it is also a problem we are seeing in the rest of the world. It is very, very important that we reclaim this tool that has given us so much. And we also have to, I think, make sure that it is accessible to as many people as possible. If those of you, some of you may have read this wonderful book I read recently by Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist. I think he wrote a book. I think the title was something like Astrophysics for Those in a Hurry. But, he has these wonderful pages where, the first 10 pages are just devoted to the nanoseconds of creation of the universe. And then he talks about the rest of our history. But as he talks about these wondrous things and the discoveries that we make, through which we know, for example, that every atom in our body, in all our bodies here, was once in a star. We know that. We actually know these things. We know that, there's now a high probability of life in at least 300 other planets that we have observed, and so on. He says that while we can engage in these wondrous speculations, they may not be accessible to everyone. They may not be accessible to a fruit picker in California. It's very important that somehow we continue to provide the means through which this part of our culture, because science is part of our cultural experiment, is in fact widespread. And when I talk about science, I don't simply mean our understanding of the physical universe. I also think about what we call social science, understanding about our own behaviors. And I think this is important because if we do take social science seriously, then we will realize that it's not enough to do good deeds, that philanthropy is not enough, that virtue is not enough. And I'd like to quote Desmond Tutu on this. He says, "There comes a point when we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they are falling. We need to understand the dynamics of social behavior and change. Who are the poor? Where are the poor? Why are they poor? What interventions can we craft to change this problem?" And we need to test these different approaches. We need to figure out whether, in fact, if you give tax breaks to the top, will all of this percolate to the bottom and eliminate poverty and inequality? This is a testable proposition. We have about 30 years of data. The answer is an unequivocal no. But we do have other approaches which work. And I think it is important as humanists that we continue to uphold this path toward evidence-based policies. It is something that we actually do have a lot of answers to almost all the problems that we're confronted with today. Most people think this is not true, but I think our technical solutions are at hand. The question really is one of political will and policy imagination. So these are two directions of thinking which I think are important. Deal with our bounded rationality and preserve and uphold and reaffirm the gift of the scientific method that we have. Now, in terms of using that to act, what are the two most important directions we should apply that? I believe that it is very, very important for us to secure our global commons and our public goods. In economic theory, we know that if you act solely in your own interest, to maximize your utility as a consumer, to maximize your profit at a firm, this behavior will come at the expense of what we call public goods, goods that you cannot exclude everyone for: clean air, security, defense, and so on. And that space of public goods is now shrinking. The most dramatic example, of course, is what is happening with greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't matter whether these greenhouse gas emissions originate from a coal-firing plant in Ohio, or auto emissions in Shanghai, or cattle rearing in Brazil. They all contribute to a single planetary atmosphere, a single energy system, and it affects all of us. This, if you want, is a negative aspect in our public good. And we saw this very dramatically this last summer. Of course, we lived through Harvey, we lived through several hurricanes and those in the Caribbean. But if you looked at the headlines in August around the world, and I did this as an experiment, as we were going through Harvey, I went through different regions, media in different regions of the world. And what did I find? There were extreme weather patterns everywhere. Extreme rainfall in Mumbai, extreme drought in Eastern Africa, extreme high temperatures in Europe, and so on. Every region of the world was affected. And it has to be that way because we do share this common atmosphere, this common energy system. And therefore, it is very important, I think increasingly important from an existential standpoint, for us to preserve these global commons. And I do believe we can do that. Now, when I say we should preserve public goods and that private behavior sometimes distorts our ability to achieve that, I'm not recommending that we throw out the market system. Because as an economist, as most reasonable economists, I think we would say markets can do a lot of things, but they can also fail. And what is important is that we find ways to remedy or correct those failures. And these questions are often far too important to be left to economists, far too important to be left to politicians. We have to exercise our will as citizens, as global citizens, to make those choices that do, in fact, bring us these public goods. And when I think of public goods, I don't just think about material goods. I would also argue that certain rights, universal rights, I think, should be considered public goods. Very importantly, for example, reproductive rights. Very, very important universally. I think this is a universal we should consider that can only bring good to all of us. One of the things that I learned in working on international development for 25 years, and I worked in many different areas, macroeconomic policy, financial policy, but when I put away all of the things I learned, the essential lesson that I found most important is this. If we can give education to every girl in every society in the world, if we can give entrepreneurship opportunities to every woman, almost all the other problems will find a way of solving themselves. This is true. We've got evidence. I look at where my parents originated, in a part of South India, I've never lived there, but called Kerala. And Kerala has this remarkable paradox of a 99+% literacy rate, and where, because of a matriarchal system, the women have a lot of power, where the socioeconomic indicators are comparable to any so-called advanced economy, even though there's a problem of employment. And a lot of people, millions of people in Kerala, have gone elsewhere in the world to work as doctors and engineers to find jobs. But we see that the basic problem of social welfare has been solved because women do have access to education and entrepreneurial opportunities. And so this is one aspect, I think, of universal ethics that is important. And I don't believe that as we should take the cultural relativist position to saying, well, in this culture, women have to be treated differently. That is part of the culture. No. You're almost certainly going to find, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, or anywhere else in the world, that there are women who are actually fighting to make this a part of their own culture. And the best thing that we can do to help is to actually address these problems here at home, because we have a record that we need to correct. I believe we rank 72, the United States now I'm talking about, in the world in terms of number of legislators, female legislators in the world. I think number one is Rwanda, and Norway follows that. So we've got a lot of work to do there. We didn't do as well in 2016. Hopefully we're going to do a lot better in 2018. I think that's a very important direction. So that's the third thing, securing our global commons. And finally, I think the other direction all of this leads us into is avoiding the politics of despair. What I mean by that is we have an increasing tendency around the world now to blame the other. And the other can be foreign goods, it can be foreign labor, it can be foreign ideas. It is very convenient to do that, but it is both it's a self-defeating enterprise, because you're not going to stop what you perceive as the problem. And in a way, one is framing the problem wrongly. There's a whole literature, for example, that is developed around migration. And some of you may be familiar with it. And based on the models that we have, we know that if migration were open in the world today, borders were truly open, we are not going to see millions of hordes swarming across the Rio Grande or from the Mediterranean to Europe. In fact, most people, 95% of the world, who live within 250 miles of where they were born, that pattern is likely to continue. What we're more likely to see is as people move to places where they can be most productive. And the estimates, therefore, we have of the economic impact of open borders is on a conservative side from 20 to 60% of an increase in global GDP to as much as 200%. These are the models that we have right now, and we can debate some of the assumptions. But this shows us once again that if you want to get somewhere, you really need to think about the means of getting there and sort of put aside some of the biases or prejudices that we may have that prevent us from getting there. Now, some people think this is just an intellectual exercise. It's just a matter of thinking the problem away. Albert Einstein in the 1930s, who confronted xenophobia, prejudice, if you want, in Europe, he said this: arrows of hate have been aimed at me too, but they have never hit me because somehow they belong to another world which I have no connection with whatsoever. Albert Einstein's a wonderful humanist. I applaud him. Unfortunately, the choice that he had at that time is not available to everyone. I think, for example, of women from El Salvador during Hurricane Harvey who were wearing ankle bracelets put on them by immigration courts who were adjudicating their cases, and who, as their basements were flooding, were wondering, if I have a damaged bracelet and I go to one of these shelters, what will happen to me? Because the Customs and Border Patrol has said I will be arrested immediately along with my children. What choice do I have? What choice does the Rohingya woman who I heard of last week, who was forced out of her village in Myanmar and walked, she was 9 months pregnant, walked, I believe, 100 or more miles to a village in Bangladesh where she was told that a newly born baby would not receive a birth certificate. Agency is not something that we all have to the same degree. But if we can accept certain predicates, if we do believe that it is important for every human being to realize their potential, it is important because it's good for all of us, then I think we need to somehow find a means, even though it's very hard to do, of empathizing with all to the extent that we can. I don't do it. I don't get up every morning thinking about the 8 billion souls who inhabit this planet with me. But I'm increasingly conscious that I have to look at my shortcomings in my ability to do this. And I know that there will be several reactions to what I'm saying this morning. I've given this presentation several times, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you say, this is extremely idealistic, it's not possible, it actually goes against our nature. That's a valid reaction. Or you may say you're preaching to the converted. We all accept what you're saying, but there's a whole lot of others you have to convince. I'm not here to try and convince you. I'm here to try and remind myself, and perhaps you, that there is an element of choice that we have. And I want to close by quoting a neurologist, psychologist, Viktor Frankl, who is a Holocaust survivor. You may have heard of him. This is what he says. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Thank you.